Welcome back. We have arrived now at the end of the first week, June 30th, 2016. I'd like to congratulate you on making it all the way through the first week. And we now have arrived at chapters 5 and 6 of the textbook. Before discussing the content here, let me please remind you that you are going to need to make sure that you enroll again in the forum registration for attendance so that I make sure that you're here. Also, please make very certain that you open the schedule each time that you are watching one of these videos so that you can follow along in the outline that's provided in the entry for that schedule. It's very important that you have that available so that when you're reading the textbook and also when we are discussing various points here in the videos, you'll be able to see the full content right together. Okay, without further ado, let's get started and talk about the two subjects for chapter 5 about the great goddess that I will cover here, Hecate and Demeter and Persephone. Even though there's actually quite a bit more than those two in the chapter, I'll stick with these two for simplicity's sake because they illustrate very nicely the general concepts about the great goddess given in chapter 5. Let me, however, first begin with a few introductory comments about the great goddess. It's actually an interesting point in itself that we even have a chapter about the great goddess because the great goddess is in fact one of the oldest divine forms that we can find in European mythology. And as you can see in the chapter, and I won't take time to review it here, there are many examples of very early Near Eastern art pieces and even occasionally literature that illustrate the presence of a really ancient overarching female figure. It appears, however, that because Greek society was predominantly patriarchal, meaning that the husband was in charge of a household, and the women were in a subordinate position, that the great goddess concept did not end up playing a prominent role in more developed Greek mythology, that it took a back seat to a structure of Greek mythology in which the male figures and the male gods ended up being more predominant. So we know that that's not always been the case because on Crete we have a surviving law code called the Gortyn, G-O-R-T-Y-N, Gortyn law code that seems to suggest that at home a woman was in fact in predominant control of the household. But with Athenian society, it seems to be predominantly the men. Women, in fact, in Athens were not able to own property, which means that they could not inherit property from their husbands. They could only hold it in trust for a child or for a future husband. They had to marry usually right away once they did become widowed, and they did not hold very many other rights. For instance, they were not able to vote, they could not hold office, they could not sit in the assembly, and they didn't have many of the other general privileges that men enjoyed in society. So as such, it's probably not fitting too much for a goddess figure in Greek mythology to be ruling everybody else. So of course we do have, as you saw in the last couple of chapters, we have in Greek mythology an overarching great goddess figure, Gaia. She is remember, the earth who is tied with her husband Uranus, the sky. But as you notice, Gaia takes a back seat gradually as first the Titans and then the Olympians become much more in control. And so in time, once you have Zeus, the patriarchal king and father of the gods, in charge, then clearly Gaia is not going to exert anywhere near as much influence as she did at the beginning. So with those general ideas in place, we'll now move to a discussion about two specific goddesses described in chapter 5, again as just examples, not meant to be comprehensive. We're going to talk about Hecate, and we're going to talk about Demeter and Persephone, whose hymn you read today in chapter 5. So first of all, let me talk about Hecate. And actually, I would first like you to pause your video and please open the document attached to the schedule unit, Hesiod's Theogony, that about 40-page passage taken from Hesiod's Theogony. So please pause your video and open that document and have it ready. Okay, are you ready? Do you have that document? All right, you'll notice that that document, first of all, contains a passage that is not at all kept in your textbook in the passage of the Theogony of Hesiod back in chapter 3. In fact, this passage is a rather unusual one for Hesiod because he pauses his main narrative to give this surprisingly lengthy and elaborate praise of the goddess Hecate. She apparently is all-powerful. That, by the way, should be a tip-off that there's something here that won't gel well with the later Olympian model. But for the moment, she is all-powerful. She's powerful on earth, in the sky, and at sea. And she, as you can see in that passage, she's described relatively benevolently by Hesiod. So what changed? Well, one of the things to observe is that Hecate is powerful specifically on the earth, which does mean that that would include the underworld. So I have a little theory that psychologically, if the same story has in it a nice, gentle part and a scary, dreadful part, the scary, dreadful part will be the more memorable because it's more fun. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but that's my sort of half-joke theory. I think it is somewhat truth, though, with Hecate, because it seems that the aspect of her that was infernal, tied with the underworld, is what ended up taking prominence, because eventually she turned into a goddess of witchcraft. Here's Medea. You may know her as the famous witch who basically single-handedly took down her husband Jason after he deserted her for another woman. Medea used witchcraft to go after Jason and prayed to Hecate as inspiration for that witchcraft. So Hecate also was associated with the hunt, with the nighttime, with dogs, and you'll notice that those are similar attributes to the Olympian goddess Artemis. It appears that Hecate was an earlier goddess with those attributes, and that Artemis eventually ended up taking over those attributes later when the Olympian pantheon was established. So Hecate is an example of the great goddess model, like a very powerful female figure who ends up, again, essentially stepping backstage once a whole series of newer gods and goddesses come forward, and specifically a group in which the male god is predominant. There is also one other reason why Hecate might not have had too good a press in Greek mythology, and that's this. Because Hecate was associated with the earth, she was known as a chthonic goddess, C-H-T-H-O-N-I-C. That word comes from the Greek word chthon, which means earth. Earth goddesses have the difficulty of being associated with rather nasty stuff: bugs, insects, snakes, scorpions, other things, creepy crawly things that can injure you, especially those snakes, because snakes can shed their skin, which means that they look immortal, and the whole concept of the snake going in and out of earth tends to tie the snake closely to the female, which is perhaps one reason why in the Bible, as we saw in chapter 4, Eve is the woman is the one approached by the snake from the tree of knowledge of good and evil to try to tempt her to eat the fruit from that tree. So the idea of trickery, temptation, something that's uncertain, something we're not comfortable with, tends to be associated with the female element of nature, and the snake goes along with that. And because, again, of the snakes being able to slide in and out of the earth and shed their skin and be reborn, there's also a sense that snakes appear to live forever, and that's probably also not a very comfortable thing for male mortals to deal with. So that may be another reason, the chthonic aspect of Hecate, that might have put her in second place. And in contrast to that, the gods on Olympus are known as celestial gods, associated with heaven or the sky, and they were always much more popular in the later Greek times. So that's Hecate. We now turn to Demeter and her daughter Persephone. Now, the work of literature you read is called a hymn, and there is a series of hymns that are essentially dedicatory poems to specific gods and goddesses. There was a group of them that was associated with the author Homer, But we in fact know for a fact that Homer could not have written them because they were not published until at least 200 years after his time, which was about 800 to 700 BC, similar to Hesiod. So these hymns were probably more like 600, 500 BC, so they cannot be associated with Homer. But they are somewhat in his style, and therefore they are referred to us as the Homeric hymns, so we do call them the Homeric hymns. But in reality, they are not actually Homer. And again, a hymn in this context is a specific dedicatory poem to a god or goddess, probably at a public occasion. So it's a little different from what hymn might mean today. If, for instance, you think of hymn in a Christian church context, it's not actually quite the same thing. So now, Demeter. You see her in the hymn fall into a state of mourning when her daughter Persephone is grabbed out of a meadow by Hades, who is, interestingly is actually her great uncle, as well as her uncle, oddly. She's grabbed. And the problem here is that Hades has actually had a deal with Zeus, because Zeus may have possibly fixed the allotment of Mount Olympus, sea, and Hades to get it that Zeus, of course, got the best one. Poseidon got the second best one, the sea, and then poor Hades got stuck with the bottom one, the underworld, where he would never be popular and no one would ever pay any attention to him. So, perhaps as a way of making it up to him, Zeus promised Hades Persephone. Now, in marriage. That meant, however, that Hades had to come up from the underworld and grab her. She's picking flowers at the point when she is seized. So essentially, taking her down into the underworld effectively is tantamount to deflowering her in both senses. She loses her flowers that she's picking, and of course she also is deflowered because she will no longer be a maiden. She's now about to become a wife. Now, there's a lot of somewhat semi-amusing connection between marriage and death that can be brought into this. Of course, many spouses often do consider marriage to be the equivalent of death. That's sort of half joking. But there's actually a somewhat more serious side to this. We, in fact, have artwork that shows, curiously, pictures of a satyr, S-A-T-Y-R. That's a half-man, half-goat figure who worships Dionysus. You may remember Grover from Percy Jackson. A satyr pushing a woman on a swing, going back and forth like this. And it's been thought that possibly this swinging isn't just a play. It is actually the woman swinging from her old role as maiden into her new role as wife, which means that the swinging means that she actually has died. And in fact, we have several images in different stories about a woman who is either killed or executed or commits suicide by hanging. And the hanging effectively transfers her from the living world to the dead world. And when, of course, her body is hanging, it's swinging. So, in effect, Persephone is, in going from the above world to the nether world, is transferring from life to death, which also means that her identity as maiden or virgin is being shed, see, snakeskin shedding, in place of her new identity as a wife. And because this was agreed upon between Zeus and Hades, curiously, this is considered legitimate, even despite the violence that seems to be associated with it. In fact, marriages often did involve essentially the capture of a bride over into the new family. So although it's rather extreme in its language here, in fact, the concept is not quite as barbaric as it might sound. However, the effect on Demeter is absolutely agonizing, because in fact, she was not part of the deal, and she is really angry. So she condemns the earth to eternal suffering, no agriculture, no warm weather until something is rectified. When she goes to Eleusis, here's the Eleusinian Mysteries. When she goes to Eleusis, which is a region of Attica, the territory that surrounds Athens, she goes there dressed as an old woman in disguise because she's mourning. And the royal family of the city invites her to the palace to take care of their infant son. Maybe as an effort to replace her own lost daughter, Demeter starts placing the child overnight on the fireplace in order to make him immortal. It goes wrong, however, because a slave girl observes this and tattles on Demeter to the queen, who then, her name is Metaneira, she then comes down one night to observe what Demeter is doing. Of course, she shrieks in horror, "What are you doing to my son?" Demeter grabs him, actually throws the baby down on the floor. Boy, is she angry. And then she reveals herself and says, "How stupid mortals are. They can't even recognize a god." Never mind the fact that she was disguised so that she wouldn't be recognized in the first place. You can't reason with her, obviously. So she's furious. And from that fury, she demands the building of a temple and the establishment of a new rite to observe her in compensation for the offense. And of course, the poor baby, Demephon, his name is, never does receive the immortality that he's supposed to get. So, as a result of this further negative incident, Demeter becomes even more angry. And finally, Zeus realizes that he somehow has to get Persephone back up. And so he sends Hermes down to the underworld to retrieve Persephone. And unfortunately, when Hermes arrives, he discovers that Persephone, unfortunately, has already eaten a pomegranate seed. The pomegranate itself is a fruit of fertility, and it's probably not by accident that Hades managed to get Persephone to eat one. Eating something in the underworld immediately binds her to the underworld. It means that she cannot leave. Well, now we have a real crisis. We have Demeter, who is going to destroy humanity. We have the fates that are going to be violated if Persephone leaves the underworld. And that's how a compromise has finally worked out, that Persephone, in fact, will spend half the year down in the underworld and half the year with her mother, and that will cause the change of seasons, whereby you will have nice weather when Persephone is with her mother, and you will have cold, forbidding weather, fall and winter, when Persephone is down in the underworld. There is also, however, one more interesting aspect of this myth to talk about, and that is that Persephone, in going down into the land, is really associated with the seed that is planted, and Demeter, therefore, represents essentially the harvest that will then come up in order to feed the people. So there, in fact, was a rite tied in with this mystery about the planting, which is Persephone going down, and then the harvest, the plants coming up, which would be Persephone coming back up to rejoin her mother. Because of the problem about mankind almost dying because of this temper tantrum on the part of Demeter, there is a rectification made. Once the deal is made, Demeter has another son named Triptolemus, which means of 3 cities. And Demeter teaches Triptolemus the art of agriculture, so that Triptolemus himself may go down to humanity so that they can learn the art of agriculture and are no longer dependent on Demeter directly. And that's a concept we're actually going to revisit with Apollo later, the fact that we no longer have, like we have in Homer, gods and humans interacting directly. Instead, we have a split. So now gods stay up here, humans stay here, and there has to be an intermediary between them in order for there to be contact. So Triptolemus essentially acts as the intermediary between Demeter and the humans, so that they can learn how to carry out agriculture for themselves, and they will not be in harm's way should there be any issues with Demeter herself. Those are some really fascinating concepts of the Greek goddess mythology associated with Hecate and Demeter. If you have further questions, of course, feel free to email me. And as always, please make sure that you answer one of the questions among the discussion question group and put it in your Dropbox or the online forum. Okay, stay right here because we now have Chapter 6 coming up in this same scheduled slot. We'll see you shortly.